Castlevania is one of my all-time favorite genres. It has an amazing amount of characters, a bit of spookiness, and just a lot of gameplay. The very first commercial I saw for Castlevania made me want to play the game. Just that beating heart and that feeling of eeriness just made me really desire the game. I play a bit of Castlevania every year to just enjoy myself around Halloween. So I thought, you know what? Let's talk about Castlevania. But instead of talking about Castlevania itself, let's talk about games that are like Castlevania, or just as similar to Castlevania, but aren't actually from the game series. To begin, let's start with what makes Castlevania, Castlevania. Let's start with the main character. He's not someone scared of the fight, or of giant monsters, or of any scary things. He runs straight towards the enemy. He is ready to attack, and he's fairly experienced. He's also fairly experienced with what he does, and has trained and prepared for it. In many cases, he has gadgets and people who can help him along his way. He also has a certain level of knowledge about the occult, and how to deal with it. So it's not just, oh, there's a monster, I should attack it with a sword, or my new weapon. There's a knowledge of how to track them, how to attack them, and how to defeat them. They're basically an occult detective, someone like Sherlock Holmes who hunts ghosts. We know a lot of different series about them, for instance Kolchak, which I showed a trailer of, Algernon Blackwood, and others. Abraham von Helsing in the Dracula series is actually one of those occult detectives, though he is a little bit of a lesser version compared to the others. In fact, the stories and series, both video game and book, were about an earlier time in Renaissance England, France, and Germany, where people were trying to understand old ideas in new ways. So, they created methods of understanding the older ways. Simply understanding magic and how it worked. Who were the Fae? How did you contact them? What were demons? How did you contact them? And other ideas were a common trait, trying to understand it in a scientific way as best they could. King James was one of the people who was trying to understand this, and had an entire book series based on understanding demons and how they worked. But if people could contact demons, then obviously they might be up to no good, and swearing themselves to things that were not of God. Therefore, there needed to be ways to stop them, and thus witch hunters became a thing. One of these witch hunters, Alonso de Salazar Frias, was actually for taking care of people and checking evidence. He created an entire system of checking evidence and making sure that people were taken care of, and having proof that they could in fact be a witch. Of the 7,000 people accused in his area, only a handful were killed. That sounds kind of weird, but compared to everyone else, he was actually using a method that would be used for the rest of history as judgment with evidence and laws within it. These ideas continued into the 19th century, where there was a resurgence of occultism amongst people, and thus the belief that some of these things might be out to get you. Rather than having witch hunters going after people, they told stories about the witches and the people doing the things, but they didn't have a lot of, fires burning and people hung. They just kind of made up some mystical stuff and left it at that. However, it left a lot of people a good opportunity to write scary books, and people read them like crazy. At the very same time, Japan was opening up to the world and considered England one of the centers of cultural understanding. So books like Dracula and many other horror stories were opening up into vampiredom in Japan. So you can imagine what they would do when they saw movies like Nosferatu or the Bela Lugosi classic of Dracula. So by the time the Hammer films were coming out, Dracula was a major thing both in Europe, Americas, and in Japan. They ate this stuff up. They made sure to have versions throughout Japan, which went on to influence games and many RPGs. Because of this, it wouldn't be any surprise that there's a video game about somebody hunting horror movie creatures, and that it would be Japanese, or that vampires would make a major character. What's really amazing about Castlevania is the production values. They always take the common story within modern video games at the time, from 2D side-scrolling to others like Metroidvania or 3D beat-em-ups. I think one of the key elements is music and storytelling. Every character has a name, has an idea of why they do things, and even a motivation. And then they create music and production values to explain what is happening. It's a wonderful addition, and I would recommend any of these games to anyone. I also want to point out that every single character and person you see in the games has the same amount of history and ideas within a movie like Star Wars, where every single thing you see has of history and a name. You just don't hear it at first. The same idea can be found in Lord of the Rings, where every single helmet and idea was worked on perfectly so that you understood how things were working culturally and story-wise within what you were viewing. Sure, you don't know the name, but you know they have one, and that the story can be told about them in many books. Now that we understand the game and the themes within it, we can go on to a different subject. What if there are some great games out there that are just like Castlevania? We just don't call them Castlevania. This isn't an attempt to explain every single game that is like Castlevania. There's just too many games out there like that. However, I do want to mention a couple games that will catch your interest. I want to make sure that you know that we're not going to list every single horror game, because they're not actually Castlevania-like. They're horror, nor does it have a Space Marine or futuristic feel to it. That's actually Aliens, or Metroid. The first game series I want to talk about is Capcom. Yeah, I know, it's a company, not a game series, but they just created a lot. The first game is Ghouls and Ghosts, which had several sequels and a wonderful arcade series, which also inspired and created the Demon's Crest series, which was around during the Super Nintendo, and then the PS2 series Maximo. Resident Evil is a horror game. However, while making a sequel for Resident Evil, they actually created the game Devil May Cry, which is about a guy with a sword taking on demons and beating up as many enemies as he could, which is definitely very Castlevania. Then, while making a Devil May Cry sequel, they made another series about a guy with a sword beating up demons in Japan called Onimusha, which is definitely Castlevania, just in Japan. Resident Evil also has games within the series that are very Castlevania. For example, Resident Evil 4 is about a man going through a village to find somebody and destroy an evil castle. He's experienced, and he takes on a lot of old-school elements within it. Resident Evil 8 has you going through a village and then attacking a castle. You're using guns, but you're hunting down werewolves, vampires, and other creatures. So it's expected to be very Castlevania-like. So for a real shock, Capcom released several Castlevania-like games. Quite often when discussing the games like Demon's Souls and Dark Souls, made by the same company, so they're basically the same game, just slightly different series, we get the, it's like Castlevania, only in 3D. And, you know, I'll go with it. It doesn't quite have the 3D horror feel to it, but it creates its own lore and it definitely works on things with a very high production value. So I'll give you it. I'll say yes. This is fairly Castlevania. There are several games based on Symphony of the Night and the others called Castlevania or Metroidvania, so it would of course look and play like a Castlevania. Vigil here does look like a Castlevania game, though it does lack a lot of the lore and feel to it. Some even work hard to get these same aesthetics as the old NES games, like Odalis here, which feels like an old NES game, but is built on a modern engine and has a lot of modern tricks within it. It's not just games. There's also movies, books, and other things that will really inspire you to play some Castlevania, or feel like Castlevania. The most obvious movie is probably Van Helsing. It's literally about a guy named Van Helsing hunting vampires and demons, including Dracula, right at the end of the movie, walking around, sort of a James Bonding it, and having a ton of lore shown. He takes on Frankenstein's monster. It's just Castlevania. It's an amazing movie, and I highly recommend it when you're doing a Halloween haunt movie. In fact, it's the movie that really inspired this video. I just kept on watching this movie and going, isn't this Castlevania? Wait, that's from Castlevania. What are they doing? What are they showing? Why is it so much like Castlevania? Eventually we just went, okay, yeah, it's Castlevania, just in a different universe, that's all. Oh, and yes, the main character is the same guy who plays Wolverine. It also has its own video game. Though I haven't played it, it looks very Castlevania in the way it's played. Then we have The Mummy with Brendan Fraser. He takes on a mummy, he has people who know what they're doing, and he doesn't mind shooting monsters. It's a lot of fun. It has horror elements, but it's not really felt like a horror movie. So you know what? It's Castlevania. The Hellboy series covers movies, books, video games, and who knows what else. It started off as a comic series. 25 years ago, 27 years ago, I can't remember. And every year they've released about 4 different books telling the story of Hellboy and the many characters he meets and interacts with. Because of that, there are a lot of books. There's been 2 movies, and then another movie that doesn't have anything to do with the first 2. And there's been a lot going on. To give you an idea of how much research they do, it actually helped me do the research for this video by just looking at the letters they have at the end of some of their books. The comics have their own special style that looks both horrific and beautiful with all the shadows and different styles it has. In fact, if you read the book series, you're going to have a long, long time getting through it. I have been buying about, 6 books a year, trying to catch up. And I've gotten through most of the Hellboy series, except for the BPRD series. Not any of the Abe Sapien, but what you're looking at right now is the Witchfinder series, telling different pieces here and there about one character, and he's got about, 6 different books so far before it even completes the story on him. And they haven't even written those parts yet. So that should give you an idea of just how much there is. There is so much research and so much lore that I almost have to compare it to Tolkien's work in how much he had to do to figure things out. There's even ancient civilizations and languages that you have to learn to get things to work correctly. On the other hand, the games aren't so good, and I wouldn't recommend them. Supernatural is about 2 brothers who hunt demons and monsters. They're quite good at it. However, that doesn't mean they don't get scarred or beat up. They're also using a lot of the same tropes and ideas that you would find in the Castlevania series. So although they never get near a castle, there's a lot of Castlevania to the feeling. I would recommend being careful around Season 5 and onwards. It just gets a little goofy after a while. But when it's good, it's really good. And when it's bad, well, it's at least funny. The Underworld series definitely has a lot of style and a lot of cool things to watch. But its lore is pretty low. It's more on, this looks cool, so we're going to show it. This is a cool idea, so we're going to show it. But there isn't as much lore. Every character doesn't have a name or an idea. But boy, is it fun. And definitely, the characters are going against big enemies and knowing what they're doing. The Blade trilogy is about a vampire hunter in New York and LA. It's exactly what you think it is. At times, he takes on Dracula. What were you expecting? But there is no castle. However, the amount of lore they add is from a comic series that has been around for decades, so there definitely is a lot to see and a lot to enjoy. So if you're into this sort of thing, you would enjoy it. It's just like Underworld. Really cool to watch, some good lore, enjoyable. Finally, I'd like to talk about moments in games where it just feels like Castlevania. The entire game isn't about Castlevania, but just this moment feels like it. For example, in the game only released in Japan, Konami YY World, there is a level entirely based on Castlevania. The entire game isn't about Castlevania, but this level definitely is, and you end up with a character that looks exactly like Simon Belmont. And it's totally okay for Konami to do this because, hey, they're the ones that made the game. Nobody's stealing from anybody. I seriously debated on whether or not I should show Doom as a Castlevania-like game. But to be honest with you, it just doesn't have enough lore, and it just doesn't have enough style in it. Barely, though. Barely. However, there is a mod for Doom, the original anyway, that's entirely about Castlevania. Castlevania Simon's Destiny. So, hey, here's a Castlevania moment. It's a really long mod, by the way. I've yet to beat it. And it's still enjoyable. So, check it out sometime. The Legacy of Kain series is, for the most part, not a Castlevania game. The characters just don't fit within the story arc. However, it does have its moments. Moments where you're beating up a bad guy, or you're looking at a big castle, and you're like, oh man, this feels like Castlevania. The Darksiders series is also very similar to Castlevania, but doesn't quite have the same elements enough. However, there are moments. You definitely will enjoy them, and the game's a lot of fun. The entire series is a lot of fun. So, quite nice. Especially when playing Darksiders 3. Zelda has a huge amount of lore. So much so that people spend whole video series just talking about it. Whole YouTube channels dedicated to just studying how the lore works. However, that doesn't mean it's Castlevania. In the game, though, Breath of the Wild, when you are actually entering into Hyrule Castle, it does become very, very Castlevania-esque. You're fighting skeletons and zombies, you're taking on monsters, there's a lot of exploration and creepiness, but because you've prepared yourself, you're safe. You choose out weapons. It's a very Castlevania feel. It has a lot of the elements, it has the gothic look to a lot of things. It's just really cool. The only thing it lacks is wall meat, honestly. So you know what? This is Castlevania at its best, as a Zelda game. And if I were being honest, I would love a Castlevania game that it was something like this. Not the PS2 game that you're all thinking about, but the game where it's just this giant open world and the center is Dracula's castle. And you're trying to prepare yourself to get into it. Oh, it would be an excellent game. And honestly, if I had a choice, that would be the next Castlevania I would play. Just take Zelda Breath of the Wild, turn it into a semi-horror battle game, and you've got it. And I think everybody reading this is just going, yeah, that would be fun. So you know what? That's my idea. Okay, so I've left links for any videos that I've copied from. I just want to thank all the people who I've taken videos from. If you want to check out more, once again, hit the links. Also, if you liked this video, hit like, hit subscribe, do something. Also, leave in the comments ideas of places or games or movies that are Castlevania-like. Even if it has a moment, describe it to me. I'd love to hear about it. Okay, catch you all later. This video has taken way longer than expected. So, sorry it's a little bit late, but there it goes. Have a good one.